Well, the roses are looking terrific, Chris, but there are so many of them that when it comes to choosing something for your garden, it's all a bit confusing.
Well, yes, indeed. There must have been something like 30,000 different varieties that have been on the market over the years. And it's very, very difficult for the ordinary gardener to sort them out and decide which is best for his or her garden.
So, could you give us any rule of thumb to help us to choose?
Well, I think you can say there are 4 main points to look out for, and I think the first of these would be vigour. Here is a perfect example. It's called the Times, absolutely full of flower, absolutely full of growth, both old growth and new growth to come. You see here, we've got lots of new buds, so that will mean in 3 to 4 weeks' time we shall have an absolute wealth of bloom replacing this that's here now.
Yes, it really looks like what gardeners call a good doer, doesn't it? And the other thing is that I think the bloom is very nice itself too. I love that colour.
So modern roses should go on flowering almost continuously. A very good example of this is flower carpet, which produces bloom until certainly the frost stop it, having started in early June.
The other thing that we haven't mentioned is that with some roses, after the flowers, you get a show of hips as well.
Yes, indeed. A good example of this is Flower Dagmar Hastrop, which colours up and looks extremely attractive from late summer right the way through into the autumn and on into the winter. When there's hardly anything else happening, you've got something attractive to look at.
The other thing you can do with climbing roses is that you can grow something through that will flower after the rose has finished flowering and extend the season that way.
Certainly, yes. You have to choose carefully, Jeff. Some of the clematis, for example, are much too vigorous and they would swamp everything all around them.
Well, this pergola walk here is a perfect example, isn't it? Lots of roses growing here with Clematis Viticella growing through, and that one, I think, is probably one of the best choices.
Don't they look super? A lovely colour contrast.
Well, one thing you haven't mentioned so far, which I think is very important, is perfume.
Yes, indeed. I think it would be my third most important point. All roses have got some fragrance. You could rate them on a 1 to 10 scale.
Now, this is one of my favourite climbing roses, Compassion, and that, I reckon, has got a real rose perfume. I can smell that from here.
Really rich, fruity scent, about 9 out of 10. And look at this inflorescence. Beautiful display. And it doesn't just end there. It goes on all the way up the bush. And look at the foliage as well. Really glossy and healthy. Roses do suffer from 3 principal ailments. The most common is black spot, which is a black mark that will spread on the leaves and will defoliate if it's not treated. Then we have mildew, which is a white fungus-like appearance that clings to the stems and to the foliage. And then finally we have rust, which is an orange blob on the underside of the foliage.
Now, all those fungus diseases can be sprayed with chemicals.
And most effectively, they will work and they will treat them. But the breeders are attempting to do something about it. And we've got a very good illustration here. This is a very new variety, Rose of the Year, called Top Marks. It's a super splash of colour. It makes a great mound and will flower continuously throughout the season.
I don't want to be critical about this, but I can see some signs of black spot down there.
Let's be fair to the plant. First of all, it's been a very black spot prone year. And secondly, these have only been in the ground for a few months. And so they haven't really had a chance to get their roots down and therefore build up immunity.
Okay, so what's the rose of the future?
Well, this is it. This is a Danish bred plant to be called Little Bo Peep. It's entirely novel, different to anything we've seen before. As a rose breeder, it excites me. It's got absolutely super health. Look at this lovely shiny foliage, smothering the plant. I visualise it almost as the plant of the future, fitting happily into today's smaller gardens, and I hope to see it in lots of new colours, but keeping the same plant habit, which the introducers describe as a shrublet. and I'm not even sure if that word exists, but it seems to exactly fit the plant.
Well, the roses have been good so far this year, and despite the wet weather, very little black spots, and perhaps because of it, no mildew at all. Now, I don't spray my roses, but what I do is try and go for disease-resistant varieties. And the vast majority of them have been free from black spot, though there has been a little bit here and there. But no problems, because I should just remove those few leaves that have been affected, and that should contain it. But if you want them to flower right the way through the season, it's essential to deadhead. Now that will prevent the plant from expending energy on making seeds. But do bear in mind that seeds are contained in hips. So if you have shrub roses that give you a display of attractive hips in the autumn, then obviously you shouldn't deadhead those. But floribundas and hybrid teas should be done, but they're done slightly differently. Floribundas have a cluster of flowers at the end of each stem, so you'll need to take those off individually, leaving the ones that have still yet to come. Now with hybrid teas, which only have one flower on the end of the stem, or of course the last flower on a cluster of floribundas, you treat the deadheading more like pruning. Count down 1, 2 at least, or even 3 leaves, and prune just above the leaf. And that should encourage a new shoot to come up and perhaps give you a flower by the end of the season. Now, of course, you can still plant roses now because they're grown in pots generally, and it's a good way to do it really because you can see exactly what you're getting. I've just been replanting this bit of border here, but notice that I've dug quite a large area. It's never a good thing to put a rose into a hole on its own in otherwise uncultivated soil, because in the winter that will become a sump and the roots will be sitting in water. Also notice that I've put lots of organic matter in here because roses are heavy feeders. And do bear in mind that if you're planting them in the mixed border, you're giving them a lot of competition. So you do need to feed them at least 3 times during the season using either a rose fertiliser or, like me, an organic fertiliser. Now you'll see that I've planted these in a group of 3 because that's the really dramatic way to grow roses. They're all growing together to make one really big bush. It is, of course, quite an expensive way of doing it too, but you can reduce that expense by taking your own cuttings. Now the normal way is to take hardwood cuttings in the autumn. I did a few last year and I noticed that they've rooted well and one of them is even flowering. But you can also take softwood cuttings at this time of the year too. It's done in very much the normal way. Just look for a good strong shoot that has grown this year, about 5 or 6 inches long, and cut it below a leaf joint. Then just trim the soft top off just above a leaf joint and remove the lower leaves, just leaving a couple on the top like that. Now you might feel that these are a little bit too much, and I think they are, so I'm just going to trim those just a little bit to avoid too much water loss. Then dip the whole cutting into fungicide as we've always done before. Shake it off a bit, put the bottom into some hormone rooting powder, and then stick it into a pot of compost consisting of 50-50 coir compost and vermiculite. Cover it up with a polythene bag, and once it's rooted, you remove the polythene bag, but grow it on in that pot, and next year you'll have a good rose for planting out, all for nothing.
The sense of smell is very much the Cinderella sense, often forgotten about by gardeners and in the past largely ignored by the plant breeders in their pursuit of size and colour. But shouldn't we plan for the nose a bit more in our gardens? Couldn't we try and overcome these problems and work out some sort of framework for comparing and talking about scents? Let's take roses. This is one of the centifolia roses, Fontaine Latour. This to me is the true old rose perfume, sort of pervasive and spicy, but Really full-bodied and fruity. Gorgeous. This is Queen Elizabeth, the Floribunda rose, and this to me is quite a different smell. It's very fruity. There's a lot of green apple in this. Once you start smelling one rose after another, you realise what a wealth of flavours there are, even within this one group. It seems to me there are about 5 main headings. There's the sort of true old rose perfume, rich and complex. Then there's the sort of spicier clove incense type scents. Then the fruity scents. Then the tea scents, which may not be very sweet, they often be quite dry. Then the sort of cold cream, calamine lotion scents, I call them. The experts call them myrrh. And then there's a group of rather unpleasant scents revolving around the Austrian briar, Rosa fetida, which is really extremely nasty. But let's bring a professional touch into this. I'm joined by 2 people who earn their living by the skill of their noses. The wine writer, Pamela Van Dyke Price, and a senior perfumer, Terry Goodacre. So let's start off with some sweet peas. Let me give you a couple, Pamela. And 2, there's not enough for 2 there. And how do you describe that, Terry?
That's a very, very narcotic, heavy, sultry fragrance with a very definite orange blossom character.
Really, orange blossom?
You can smell the honeyness, honey character.
Yeah, honey is certainly what I'm getting.
Yes,
Strong
yes.
honey smell.
And that's developed through this acacia character
Yes, right.
with orange blossom.
But I get a great freshness about this, a tremendous,
What do you mean by fresh?
well, a sort of morning smell, almost dew on it.
Right.
That's interesting because we find that a very narcotic odour, a very heavy, sultry character.
Really? No, that...
So in the garden we tend to think of the sort of narcotics coming sort of at night, really, these sort of heady, sort of jasmine-y type
Yes.
scents that come, rather than this, which seems sort of, more foody. And let's try another one. You've both got very highly developed vocabularies in your field. I wonder how much they differ from each other and how applicable might they be to the gardener.
Oh, I think that we're all looking for the same thing, the impossible, to translate a sensual experience in terms of words, and words that are going to mean something in general to everybody who hears or reads us. And if I say I want wine to have a beginning, a middle and an end, they know something. If I say a wine looks like the kind of woman who always shows her shoulder straps and they're always grubby, they know what I mean. But I would only say that. I don't think I would write it.
Yes. Because I think in gardening we always tend to deal with the sort of first impression of a scent, don't we? But they usually have a sort of quite a clear, what you might call a top note. And that's the one tends to register a bit and walk away with it, you think.
Yes, yes.
That smells of apple, that smells of honey. And there may be a lot of other complex flavours underneath. But
That's right, yes. Perfumery really can be compared to music in some respects, because in music you select a single note and you attempt to blend those notes together to produce a chord. In perfumery we do something very similar. We blend individual fragrance notes together, and what we call it is an accord.
right, so maybe that's something gardeners should think about too, is actually grouping sort of harmonious fragrances in a way, and maybe establishing different sort of moods within a garden. Almost.
Exactly. I think in the horticultural world we have such a wonderful array of fragrance notes that it would be absolutely wonderful to actually start thinking in terms of putting individual notes together to produce an accord.
So where does all this get us? Well, it seems to me that once we start concentrating on scents, as we've been doing today, we find we're really remarkably sensitive to all the different flavours. So let's focus on scents a bit more and really start exploring the scented world.
Well, on a lovely sunny morning like this, there's a real touch of spring in the air, and my roses know it too, because they've started shooting away already. So the sooner I get these pruned, the better. They were just cut down roughly last winter, just to stop them rocking away, but now they need pruning finally. Now, one of the complaints I sometimes get is that whenever I prune roses, people write in and say, Wes, but your rose doesn't look anything like my rose in the garden. And of course, with plants, this is bound to be the case. So what you need to do is just to get the basic rules in your head before you start. And those rules will suit every rose that you've got. Rule number 1 is to look for any wood that is dead or diseased. There's no point in keeping dead wood, so cut that right out down at the bottom. Rule number 2 is to remember that a bud will grow in the direction that it's facing. So what you want to do is to make an open sort of shaped bush. So you look for buds like this one that are facing outwards. And you cut to that just above it. Right, now rule number 3 is that the harder you prune back, the more a shoot is going to grow. So it naturally follows that thick shoots like this one are pruned not quite so hard, and I'm leaving this one, 6 or 8 inches long. Again, prune to an outward facing bud just above it. Whereas thin shoots like this one need pruning harder, and I'm pruning this one down to another outward facing bud about 2 inches long. Now, every few years it's also a good idea to encourage new shoots by removing completely some of the really old wood like this stuff, because that will encourage the rose to push out some new shoots. So this one I'm going to take right out. But you do need to encourage the bush now by giving it a good feed. If you're organic like me, you use a bit of pelleted chicken manure, or obviously if you're not, rose fertiliser is the thing to use. And then for the rest of the season, all you have to do is to deadhead them by removing the faded flowers, and of course keep them weed free. Gardening from Which set up a trial with the Royal National Rose Society at their grounds in St Albans, and I went to see what they were about. The trial involved planting a whole series of beds, each with 27 plants of the same variety, but they were divided into 3 lots, and each lot was pruned in a different way. The first 9 plants were pruned with a pair of secateurs in the normal way, cutting out all the old dead wood to start with, and the diseased and crossing branches, and then carefully pruning to an outward-facing bud. The second lot of 9 plants were again pruned with secateurs, but this time they didn't take so much trouble. They didn't prune out any of the dead, diseased or crossing branches, and they didn't bother cutting back to an outward-facing bud. They simply cut all the branches off at about 9 inches from the ground. And the third lot of 9 plants were butchered rather than being pruned, and they were done with a hedge trimmer. But the astonishing thing is that it's this lot that seemed to be growing the best. David Bartlett, who tends the roses, is not too enthusiastic about the idea.
To be perfectly frank, Jeff, I hate it. It falls not far short of wanton vandalism, in my opinion. It's just an awful thing to do to a beautiful plant.
Well, what harm does it do?
As yet, over the long term, we don't really know. But if you look in there, the dead wood, the thin, spindly growth, crossing growth, just completely wrong for good treatment of a rose bush. Everything it goes against the grain.
Do you think that the old method of pruning was really just a sort of a bit of mystique that people deliberately invented?
There's a dark suspicion that the head gardener felt it helped him keep his job, I suspect. But I can certainly say now that the amateur gardener, who has perhaps often been put off by the difficulties of growing and cultivating roses, need not be put off by this aspect any longer. They're as tough as old boots.
As a well-known organic freak, you may be a bit worried about me spraying my roses. Well, you needn't. All I'm doing really is getting my daily fix. This is the sweetbriar or eglantine rose, and I think it's one of our very best natives. It never actually seems to get attacked by black spot or mildew or even insects in my garden, and it has these lovely single flowers with a superb sweet perfume. But the real distinguishing feature is that after a shower of rain, the leaves themselves become aromatic and smell of fresh apples. And of course, if you've got no rain, well, you put it on by hand. Oh, it's better. Now I'm ready for a day's work. Since the Clean Air Act in the 1950s cut the sulphur in the air, black spot has been the scourge of roses, and this variety gets it particularly badly. This is Paul's Scarlet, and it is prone to black spot, and quite honestly, I don't think it's a very good variety anyway, so my answer is going to be to pull it out and replace it with a variety that is disease resistant. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that you should pull out all your roses, but what I do suggest is that before you buy new ones, you should check very carefully to make sure that they're disease resistant, because quite a few of them now are. But replacing roses is not that straightforward, because if you put new roses where old ones have been, they're quite likely to suffer from a disease called replant disease, and that can kill them. Now, there's not a lot known about this disease at the moment. Some people think that it's due to eelworm and others to poisons from the roots of the old roses. Now, you can actually sterilise the soil with chemicals, but it's a bit complicated and not that effective. But one very effective way is to replace the soil. I'm replacing another disastrous rose down here, and I've already dug the hole, which should be 2 foot square by at least 1 foot deep. I put a bit of compost or manure in the bottom and then refill with soil. A little bit more muck on the top and you're ready for planting. I'm going to replace this one with a variety called Dublin Bay, which is a lovely deep red, slightly scented, and this one is more resistant to black spot. So that one should do quite well. Now, you'll have noticed on the Paul's Scarlet that all the blooms are up at the top, and that is down to the pruning. And quite honestly, that isn't the best way to do it. This is the way you should really train them. These have been tied very closely around the posts, and you can see that they've been pulled down quite a bit too. That restricts the sap and encourages blooms right the way from the bottom of the plant up to the top again. And this is an old variety called Alberic barbier, and it's got these lovely, slightly scented, creamy yellow blooms. But it won't go on flowering right the way through the season. So what I've done here is to grow through it a clematis called Viticella étoile violette, and that will give me nice deep purple blooms in the autumn when the rose has finished flowering. And then when the clematis is finished, you can cut it right down at the bottom, pull out all the old rubbish, and the following year it'll do the same thing again for you. Now, this one is particularly good as a rose for a post like this, but it's also good on a north-facing situation too.
Traditionally, this is the place that rose breeders choose to launch their new creations. One trend in recent years has been the introduction of new old roses. Peter Beale specialises in that vintage look, and no wonder he's won a gold medal. His stand must be the most romantic at Chelsea this year. I'm surrounded by soft colours, soft foliage, gentle petals, and a really heady wall of scent. David Austin's one breeder who's really helped put new old roses on the map. He tries to combine the softer qualities of vintage roses with the repeat flowering of the modern varieties. Among his introductions this year is the exquisite Redoute. Of the modern roses launched this week, the prettiest include Richard Buckley from Burrows, named after a young man who died in an accident that, thanks to the donor card he was carrying, saved the lives of 5 others. Daily Post from Friars, Many Happy Returns from Harkness, and the Patio Rose City Lights from Mattox.
Gareth, you won Rose of the Year with top marks this year, and it did pretty well, didn't it?
It certainly did. It won with the highest points ever in the history of the competition. and also won a gold medal from the Royal National Rose Society, and that's the first time a Rose of the Year has ever won that.
It's a bit of a vibrant colour though, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's useful. It's going to liven up borders. It's going to be ideal for those patios. I think it'll add life to drab spots. I think it's going to be rather nice.
I must say that the foliage looks really healthy, strong.
That's most important. It's got to have disease resistance.
So if I'm a gardener, how do I know whether a rose is disease resistant or not?
Well, I think disease is top of the list of breeders' priorities now anyway. And I think most of the modern roses have got a very high resistance to disease. So I think if you stick to those, you're not going to be doing so badly. And I think many of the older varieties are gradually being weeded out. But if in doubt, have a word with a local rose specialist and he'll surely put you right on disease resistance.
Where did top marks come from?
Oh, that came from a little secret weapon that we have in the hybridising house. It was a seedling in 1979. It showed all the characteristics of being a perfect rose. Wonderful habit, nice bushy growth, very prolific, but unfortunately the flower was just no good. So we just use it for breeding. Unfortunately for us, it's giving us success. It gave us the Rose of the Year for 1988 Sweet Dream, and also top marks, and one or two others as well.
Now's the time to keep an eye out for rose suckers, because you want to catch them before they get too big. Never let them get to this size, which I've only left on here, of course, just to demonstrate to you. Well, that's my excuse anyway. But eventually they could take over the whole bush. Now, they come from the rootstock. All roses are budded onto a relative of the wild rose, and this is coming from that rootstock. Now, there is a story that you can recognise suckers because they've got 7 leaflets, whereas the ordinary rose has got 5. It isn't really true. This one has got 7 on some and 9 on some leaves, and if you look at the variety, some of them have got 5, and just to confuse matters, some of them have got 7. But quite honestly, it's very easy to recognise the difference between the sucker and the rose. Just look at it. And what you need to do before it takes over the whole bush is to get down there and trace it down as low as you can, right to the bottom of the bush, and if you can, just rip it off, the whole thing bodily. Now, that's coming now, I think. If you can't get it right off, then what you'll have to do is to cut it off with a pair of secateurs. I'm not going to win with that. So cut it off with a pair of secateurs just as low down as you possibly can, and then you'll have to keep an eye on it in the future because it's bound to regrow. Now, what would happen if you just left that sucker on? Well, it would produce a rose with some very nice single pink flowers, followed by red rose hips in the autumn. But the trouble is, it does grow enormous, much too big for a small garden. Perhaps if you've got a country garden with a quick thorn hedge or something, it might be an idea to grow a wild rose through that. Or alternatively, if you really can't face the thought of cutting out suckers, why not go for a rose that's all suckers? One of the species, like Rosa pimpinellifolia, which makes a nice little suckering shrub and really great for the front of the border.